actually has experience.
That's the key. This man is a trained police officer who trains other police officers, and it happened to him.
Okay, can we go to the next slide?
Yes. The article continued, as happens for most people in life or death situations, the brain begins to manipulate the perception of time. People will very often say in a situation like that, my whole life passed before my eyes. Or, I felt I was running, but everything seemed to be in slow motion. These are the normal occurrences that are caused by distortions to the brain, because the brain has actually been affected by all of these hormones, this flood of hormones going through the body. It changes our perception of things. In moments of stress, the brain doesn't allow us to contemplate. It doesn't allow us to reflect on this, to write a poem or to come up with a song. The only thing that happens is that the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that makes us human, goes offline, leaving the functions to this old-fashioned, the old part of the brain, shared by all vertebrates, fish included, and nothing else that you can do will reverse that until the fear is diminished and the hormones deplete from the body, from the brain. And typically, after an adrenaline rush, he noticed when he was in the ambulance, his body began to shake. A common occurrence in situations like this.
All right, and so for somebody who's a trained police officer, are you telling us that he had no control over these physiological responses?
We don't have control. When the old brain, our emotions take over, we don't have control. That's why sometimes people make very bad decisions regarding relationships because their emotions overpower their reasoning.
You may continue.
Okay. Oh, back to the brain. Perfect. Okay, so I want to talk to you about when we have these stressful situations, okay, and we have this physiological response that occurs that we can't help. And you talked about the hippocampus shutting down.
Yes.
Okay, so tell us about then memory. Do we have any control over trying to remember things during this stressful period?
The hippocampus mediates all memory. If we did not have a hippocampus, well, probably there'd be some other organ that did the job, but if the hippocampus is damaged, and as I indicated to you earlier, in people with Alzheimer's disease, we can actually see a shrinkage of the hippocampus, which is another reason why people don't have good short-term memory when they get older, because the hippocampus is shrinking. And if the memories are not formed because it's shut down, it's entirely possible, and actually highly likely, that someone will not be able to recall anything about a situation. Or if they do, it would be foggy or bits and pieces. But this is common, this is well known, and it's not really not arguable.
Okay, what about, when you say memories formed, is it, I think of it as being implanted. Is that something, or is that not correct?
We really don't know. Honestly, to this day, we still don't know. We think maybe somehow memories, long-term, this is what happens. Short-term memories are formed in the hippocampus. And then over a period of days, including sleep, by the way, REM sleep, this rapid eye movement sleep, when our body twitches and so on, we notice it in our dogs and cats sometimes. It's during that period that these short-term memories from the hippocampus are converted into something, we're not exactly sure, and that are stored in long-term memory. We don't know how that's done. It may be coded in proteins, and the research is just beginning in that area. We do know, by the way, that memories are not encoded in one place in the brain, but they seem to be globally distributed. It's almost like a RAID computer system, where the data is distributed.
Okay, so if the hippocampus isn't working, does that mean that the short-term memories aren't there to be able to be coded and sent out?
That's it, yeah.
Okay. We've heard that Ms. Arias described it like being in a fog with regard to her memory. When we talk about these memory issues with the hippocampus not working, are we talking about just memory, or does this go to how a person is capable of doing things, like driving a car? During
the period of the fight or flight reaction, the things that we maintain control over are either fighting back a perceived danger or fleeing the scene. What happens or which one occurs is not clear. We don't know how, why or how that happens. I guess it's circumstances to some degree. But once a person enters this state, while the memories are not being formed, any activities that are involved in fleeing seem to be able to occur, such as running away, or getting into a car and driving away, or getting on a horse and trotting away. So it seems very specific to the development of new memories. Some parts of the brain still continue in an almost automatic fashion, and that's how we survive.
All right, so when we talk about this memory or this fogginess going on, then people are certainly able to drive a car, you're saying?
Yes, it's very possible, sure.
And they don't just become like a zombie then?
No, some people might,
okay,
but I don't think most people do.
Okay, and is that the purpose of the brain, so that the survival instinct?
Yes.
That we can still function?
That we can still survive and reproduce ourselves.
Okay. Now what... in these high-stress situations, let's say you take a car accident again, this fight or flight type situation, how fast are things going on in a person's brain at that point?
Well, things go on in real time, but a person's perception of how long things are going on can change. Many people report that time seems to slow down. And I'm sure many of you have either read that or heard about it or maybe even experienced yourselves. Time seems to slow down. A person's running down a corridor, but it seems like it's forever to get there. We know that time is an experience that can be influenced by various things, various chemical changes, including drugs can slow down or even speed up the perception of time.
Okay, but in reality, that doesn't mean that the person actually has any more time to think.
That's correct.
Did you ever do any work with hypnosis in trying to recover memories?
Yes, with the police department, I have some advanced training in hypnosis, used to teach hypnosis. But I would be asked by the police department to try to help the officers remember details of what had transpired because they didn't remember it. And most of the time we failed. Hypnosis can be helpful if there's something there that's being psychologically repressed. And then maybe we can release some of that repression. But if the memories aren't there, they ain't there.
So even with hypnosis, you can't get it. You can't. There's no memory to get.
If there's nothing there, there's nothing to get.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about memory of things not under stressful situations, okay? You mentioned that you read through Jodi's journals.
Yes.
And you said they started from when?
Either junior high school or high school.
Okay, so younger, when she was a teenager?
When she was quite young, yes.
And does it help our memories when people write things down?
Absolutely.
There's a lack of foundation, also speculation as to what the defendant's memory was back then. She couched it in terms of Miss Arias. He can't know what her memory was. No one can.
I said our memories. Does it help our memories?
No.
All right. I'm going to ask that you rephrase your question to clarify.
All right. To clarify, doctor, I'm talking generally speaking. When people write things down, does it help to remember them?
It does. When I was a graduate student, before we had these, recorders on our cell phones, I would listen to the conversation, the lecture, and I would write it down, even if I thought I could remember, and my memory was better then than it is now. But when you write it down, two more things happen. Not only do you hear it, but you're also imprinting the movement of your handwriting, which is another layer of learning. And when you're transposing it and you see it, you're adding yet another layer of association. So the best way for someone to learn is to expose yourself to as many senses as you can simultaneously. And that's one way that you can actually improve your memory. So the fact that things were written down likely improved her ability to remember them.
As lack of foundation, speculation as to Miss Arias' memory, he said, likely improved her memory, was the phrase.
You want to respond?
Judge, he's talking about people's memories, and I think he's certainly qualified to discuss what memory can do when things are written down.
Clarify that he's speaking in general.
All right, Dr. Samuels, generally speaking, if somebody keeps a journal or a diary and they write down their daily activities, okay? Generally speaking, does that help the person if they were to review their diary years later? Does it help that person to remember what occurred, what that person wrote down?
Absolutely. In fact, in this book, The Brain Training Revolution, I was responsible for coming up with the exercises to help older people strengthen their brain. And one of the things was write down things you do, tell a story about what you're doing, use the written, use the auditory, use the visual, and that strengthens the memory. So that's well known.
Okay, so it's well known that just by writing it, it strengthens the memory?
Here,
Overruled.
I'm sorry, go ahead and
the
answer.
more modalities we use simultaneously, the better. In fact, people who exercise while they're learning seem to be able to learn faster than people who are just sitting at a desk learning.
Interesting. All right, so let's talk about something called acute stress.
Could you repeat that?
Acute stress.
Oh, acute stress, yes.
Can you tell us what acute stress is?
Yes. Acute stress is a condition, and it's actually a DSM diagnosis, which is called an acute stress disorder.
Let me ask you first. You're holding up a book that says DSM-4?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us what DSM-4 is?
Okay. The American Psychiatric Association periodically puts together what's referred to as the Bible of Mental Health Disorders, which is used internationally. And a very large panel of experts in psychology and psychiatry get together maybe every 10 years or so to review the criteria for specific disorders. So, if, for example, I say that someone has a bipolar II disorder, I'm not going to explain what that is. Somebody else on the other side of the globe will know what symptoms they have, what its etiology is, so we know we're talking about the same process. So in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, amongst the many diagnoses that exist is something called an acute stress disorder.
Okay. And what is acute stress disorder?
Acute stress disorder occurs when someone is in a state of acute distress, psychologically or physically, because of the fact that it impacts the body in a physiological manner, as I indicated before, which produces certain behavioral and psychological effects on that individual. And the criteria for that are fairly clearly laid out in the book. And
Just have it marked. He keeps referring to the book. Right. I may need it.
Yes, we will do that at the break. You may continue.
And again, this is a diagnostic and statistical manual. And we can then say, if this person has these criteria, which have been laid down by these learned people and is approved worldwide, then likely we can use that label for that person and describe their problems as having the particular diagnosis.
Okay. All right. So, and is this the DSM-4? Is this something? Well, 4 is just the revision, right?
There
the
was
level.
a DSM-2, there was a DSM-3, there was a DSM-4, and there was a DSM-4-TR, text revision. This is the original. This is the one I bought a long time ago.
Okay.
And the reason I don't use the text revision one is that it's meaningful to me. But other than describing some of the things in different language, it's exactly the same. DSM-5 will be out within 8 months or so. So then this gets pushed aside, and we have to learn the diagnostic categories of the new one.
Okay. All right. So talking about acute stress, when does acute stress happen?
Acute stress usually happens in reaction to something in the environment that produces either psychological or physiological stress for the individual. Stress being defined as a condition where we feel anxious, where the amygdala kicks in, and we begin to feel a shortness of breath, or our heart begins to pound, or we begin to sweat, those kinds of symptoms.
Okay. So something that would be considered like a trauma, something very
Something
stressful?
very severe, some very severe trauma, yes.
All right. And how does it happen?
Well, what happens is, just as I described earlier, a condition occurs, the amygdala sends out signals and hormones to different parts of the brain, the body goes into a fight or flight reaction, and we are then in a period of stress, the symptoms of which I've described.
Okay. Did you prepare PowerPoint slides to help explain what acute stress is and the amnesia part of it?
Well, actually, yes, the amnesia part I did.
Okay. All right. And Judge, may I demonstrate that to the jury?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. When we talk about acute stress, and it floods the amygdala, floods the hippocampus.
Back to the slide as amnesia and crime, since it's vouching.
Judge, it's the title of the article that Dr. Samuels relies on.
All right, establish that fact.
I will. There. When we talk about the hippocampus shutting down and no memories forming, does that, you're saying, does that happen during acute stress?
Yes.
Okay. And is there research about this?
There's a lot of research about this.
All right. And when that happens, is there different types? What's amnesia?
Amnesia is a condition where a period of time, in terms of memory, is lost. Now, there are different kinds of amnesias. Some amnesias can last for a few hours. Some amnesias can last for years. There are some amnesias that are associated with criminality. And so these articles are an attempt to study these and understand the relationships between the formation of these amnesias, which, again, we'll have some data to look at. And because what happens is that the presence of amnesia in people who have suffered from an acute stress disorder is fairly high. And so that's why we have these articles here.
Okay. And just one more question before I show the slide. Typically, not being a psychologist, when I think of amnesia, I'm thinking we forget everything. Is that the correct way to think of amnesia in a clinical setting?
No. Some amnesias are very, very specific. Now, those are called psychogenic amnesias. We're not talking about that today.
Okay.
We're talking about the stress-induced amnesia that occurs because the hippocampus is shut down because the individual was in an acute stress reaction and the brain has been flooded by chemicals that do not allow the memories to form.
All right.
That's what we're talking about here.
All right. Should we go to the first slide?
Sure.
All right. And is this an article that you relied upon?
This is an article that I relied upon for my testimony.
All right. And can you tell us what are we discussing?
Without going into the very details, we refer to dissociative amnesia. We used to call it psychogenic amnesia or functional amnesia because it was considered at that point to be purely psychological. But now we know there's probably nothing that's really purely psychological because everything psychological is mediated by chemicals in our brain. So with that new research and understanding, we don't use that term psychogenic amnesia anymore. So we call it a dissociative state, where what we remember is disconnected from what actually went on. And it's characterized by an inability to remember an important experience or event after a traumatic experience of psychological origin. That's the definition of it. The person, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, and what happens to a person who's suffering from dissociative amnesia?
They don't remember. They don't remember anything, or only bits and pieces of what happened from the time the trauma began until sometime thereafter.
Judge, I don't think it was established. Did he establish that that was the name of the article, Amnesia and Crime? I don't think that was asked.
Yes, I asked if this was an article that he relied upon.
No, but is that the title is what I'm asking.
What was the title of the article that you relied upon?
Amnesia and crime.
Thank you. And what happens, there's a paragraph talking about detachment. What's detachment?
Detachment is an altered state of consciousness where the person feels disconnected from oneself and from the external world. In other words, nothing exists except their inner processes. They are detached from the outside world, and that is something that can exist for either minutes, hours, or even days. And
detachment, if somebody's going through detachment, does that mean that are they physically capable of being? I mean, are they able to still do things?
Yes, they can.
Okay. All right. Anything else about this particular article?
No, this was just the first of. Should I go on to the next one?
Yes, go on to the next one, please.
Now, this is in the same article.
Yes, okay. In the
Amnesia
same article.
and crime. I just needed more room.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It says that dissociative amnesia may result when detachment interferes.
You may.
know you can't see it. Can you click?
You turned it off.
No, it's okay. It'll still work.
Huh?
It'll still work. Go ahead and click it. There you go.
Okay.
All right.
Judge, again, I'm going to check for the same reasons as before.
Council approach again, please.
Back up, or did you? All right. We were talking about dissociative amnesia.
Yes.
All right. And you said, I'm sorry, how long can it last?
Dissociative amnesia can last anywhere from minutes to hours to days to weeks to months for a lifetime.
All right. And something that I want to clarify, when you say it can last, does that mean that for a lifetime a person may not recall what happened during a certain time period, or that they're not able to form memories for a lifetime?
No. They don't recall what happened during that time frame. Their ability to form memories generally comes back as long as there's no physical damage to the hippocampus.
Okay. All right. And with regard to transient amnesic syndromes, that's the next slide. Is that the title?
Yes.
Of the article that you relied upon?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell us what this article has to say?
Basically, it says that temporally circumscribed amnesia, which means time-limited amnesia, the amnesia for one period from the starting point to the end point, whatever that is associated with a specific and unusually emotionally charged event, such as a criminal offense. Now, the interesting thing is that the data shows that the proportion of amnesia is proportional to the violence of the offense, and up to 30% of convicted homicide cases have amnesia claimed at trial. There's a typo there that I missed. It says it claimed at trial. It should be claimed at trial.
Okay, so tell us what that means in layman's terms.
Well, that means that perpetrators, it's been well shown, it's been established, that perpetrators of horrible crimes can also develop post-traumatic stress disorder for having acted as the source of the crime. For example, our soldiers in Afghanistan report post-traumatic stress disorder because they were involved in the killing of the enemy. Police officers, people that I've treated, who shoot a victim, either accidentally or on purpose, deliberately in the line of duty, also can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Not all of them do. Some of them do, not all of them. Some of them develop amnesia, some of them don't. But what it's saying here is that up to 30%, and this is a study of several different studies, of up to 30% of convicted homicide cases claim to have amnesia at their trial. What's interesting is that this type of amnesia tends to affect younger people more than older people, especially in the third and fourth decade of life, in the 20s and in the 30s.
Okay. All right, and so we were talking about acute stress. How does this figure in with acute stress?
Well, acute stress is what causes the breakdown of the hippocampus's ability to store memories and is responsible for the transient amnesia because the memories aren't formed. It affects some people more than others, but 30%, up to 30%, is quite a large proportion to experience this type of event.
Okay, and is there another slide?
Yes.
All right, the title, Transient Global Amnesia, is this,
Functional anatomy and clinical implications.
all right, and what does this article tell you?
This is saying that now we're not looking at a criminal population. We're looking at the general population. In the general population, somewhere between, different studies come up with different numbers, so between 3 and 8 people per 100,000 people each year experience transient global amnesia. The amazing thing is that here are the things that can cause that. Sudden immersion in cold or hot water, physical exertion, emotional or psychological stress, pain, medical procedures, sexual intercourse, and similar events have been observed in 50 to 90% of these documented attacks of transient global amnesia. So you don't have to be in a horrible situation, but an everyday situation, and you're still prone to having this transient global amnesia.
Does that mean, so let's take the immersion in hot or cold water. Does that mean somebody won't remember being immersed?
It clouds, apparently that's been reported for people who have a lack of memory for having been immersed in the hot or cold. I don't know how they get into the hot or cold water. I didn't look at the details of the study. But yeah, that they don't remember the beginning to sometime at the end when their capacity for recollection begins to return. Will they ever remember anything? Maybe, maybe not.
All right, and as a person's capacity to remember starts to come back, okay, how does it come back? Is it just back, or is it something that is developed over time?
Usually, if it comes back, it begins to restore itself over a period of time, but there are many people that never remember the actual events. Depends on many factors. We don't know what all those factors are. We think it has to do with the intensity of the act, the degree of the shock, the duration of the shock, and so on and so forth. But I'm just presenting data here.
No, okay, here's my question.
Sure.
Is when the stressful situation has ended, okay, and so the hippocampus is now that the flood is receding, and so the hippocampus is starting to be able to work again.
That's correct.
Okay. When the hippocampus starts to be able to work again, is it something where a person's memory just starts immediately?
No, it more likely would begin to return gradually.
Okay.
In other words, it may have a sudden termination when the trauma begins, but more likely it has a gradual restoration to normalcy towards the end.
All right. And when you talk about gradual, what did you say? Gradual normalization?
Gradual restoration towards normalcy means that new memories can gradually be reformed. They don't get back what's gone.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if they're gradually reforming new memories, does that mean that their memory would be somewhat, what we would say, general population people say, spotty?
For that transitional period,
Yes.
their memories may be spotty, yes.
Okay. So, and you were moving your hand up and down before. What does that mean?
I didn't even realize that. Basically, I was showing that there is a gradual restoration to normalcy. Let's say that the normal level of memory capability is here. It's repressed here due to the stress. It gradually comes back over a period of time.
Okay.
And it's not linear either. It goes up and down, and it may be sporadic over that period of time.
Okay, and so since it's not linear or sporadic, as you say, does that mean that somebody might remember from the time of the stressful period, when the hippocampus then starts to work again, till the time that their memory is considered somewhat normal? In between that time, does that mean that they might remember certain things and not remember others?
Yes, that would be predicted from the
And
data.
because it goes up and down, does that mean that they could remember certain things closer to the stressful event, but not remember things further away from the stressful?
It's possible.
Okay.
And by the way, it's hard to predict an individual with that information, but we do know that's what happens.
And that's, I'm not asking individually, just generally speaking?
Only speaking
Is that right?
generally.
Okay. All right, is there another
I
slide?
think there was one more. Just wanted to reemphasize that this article is from the article, The Stressed Hippocampus, Synaptic Plasticity and Lost Memories. And basically the message I wanted to share with the jury is extensive rodent and animal and human research has shown that the hippocampus is not only crucially involved in memory formation, but it is also highly sensitive to stress, pointing out again that memories are not formed in many people who have experienced acute stress because chemically it just doesn't work.
And you say chemically, and that's, again, we're talking
The
about...
hormones, the adrenaline, the other hormones, and so on.
Okay. So, and when you say it just doesn't work, does that mean physically speaking, it's just not possible at times?
That's correct.
All right. All right, a little bit more about acute stress. Give me a second. How long can acute stress last?
Well, acute stress can last, long-term mild stress overall can be bad for people, sometimes almost as bad as a short duration intense stress. So we know that in order to live longer, one should lead a less stressful life. We know about that. And we do that by exercise and eating right and so on. But acute short-term stress is something that usually occurs over a relatively short period of time. The body just can't handle it for much longer periods, either physically or if there's an attack, they may be knocked out or killed or whatever. But the diagnosis of acute stress disorder can only be used for up to a couple of months, because at that point, most acute stress has dissipated, and we then have to shift to a different diagnosis.
Okay. And can acute stress be diagnosed? When can acute stress be diagnosed?
Within 2 months of the onset of the event,
Okay,
of the
so,
stressful event.
all right. So it would have to be close in time. Does the person have to be suffering from acute stress at the time for you to be able to diagnose them?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay.
Because there are certain symptoms that exist during that period that are signs that that's the correct diagnosis.
Okay. And during acute stress, you said it can last for up to a couple months.
Well, you can use the diagnosis for up to a couple of months. It usually doesn't last quite as long.
Okay. And is there a general period of time thought?
Well, you know, a week, 2 weeks maybe, that intense period, a few hours very often, sometimes a few minutes.
Okay.
But it's not a long-term thing. It's a relatively intense and of short duration.
All right. And during this intense and short duration, can a person suffer from memory gaps?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And is that due to everything we learned about the hippocampus?
The hippocampus and the amnesia that follows.
Okay. All right. I want to talk to you about specifically about your evaluation with regard to Miss Arias.
Okay.
And I have, if this would help, I have exhibit number 525, which is just a copy of your report.
Yes, that is. Do you want that?
Do you want it?
No, I asked the judge if you wanted it.
All right. Did you do any testing with Miss Arias?
I did.
And you had told us that you've met with her for over 12 different times?
Yes,
All right. And during some of those times, did you give her certain tests?
I did.
What tests did you give her?
I administered 2 psychological tests.
All right. And which are those?
I administered the Milan Clinical Multi-Axle Inventory 3rd Revision.
All right. And what else?
And then I administered to her the post-traumatic stress disorder test.
Okay. Let's talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder test. Can you tell us specifically what it is?
Yes. Actually, it's a post-traumatic stress diagnostic scale. I knew there was something wrong there.
Sorry, post-traumatic
PDS.
stress diagnostic scale.
This is a test that was developed by a well-known psychologist, and it is available commercially. It is designed to detect in a relatively short period of time the presence or absence of a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder to conform with the diagnostic criteria as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it's basically a confirmation of this diagnostic category.
Okay, so let me ask you this. As a psychologist, you have the DSM.
Yes.
And when you're meeting with somebody, do you form hypotheses about what you think their diagnosis might be?
Yes.
And do you do that based on the criteria that you see in the DSM?
Not initially. You
Okay.
get a feeling for what's going on, and you begin to remember, oh, this person's having this reaction, having this reaction. Let me see a little more closely. Then you might go through the specific criteria after reviewing the notes and spending more time with them and so forth.
And is that something that, with experience, is that these feelings that you get after meeting with people, is that something that experience helps you with as well?
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right.
I mean, I've been doing this work for a long, long time.
Okay. All right. And so with this particular test, then, does it use the criteria that's in the DSM?
Yes, both the Milan Clinical Multi-Axel Inventory, which is a general personality test, I use that one because it's also geared to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And this test, the Post-Traumatic Stress Diagnostic Scale, also conforms to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So because I suspected that they may have been post-traumatic stress disorder, and because I got indications on the Milan test that they were, I then decided to give this test, and that confirmed the presence of a post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay. All right. So that's why you picked that particular test.
Yes.
Does that explain it? How does the test actually work?
Well, it's I think 49 items, an individual.
Referring to something, if you could have it marked, please.
Yes, we'll have it marked as an exhibit.
I do need this back.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Is it okay if it's stapled on the back?
Yeah, it's okay.
All right. It's what's marked for identification is Exhibit 527. You were referring to it?
Yes.
Is that the actual test?
This is the manual that comes with it. The test is reproduced within. Basically, it consists of about 49 different items. The individual checks off the items that are relevant to them. And then it can either be computer scored, which I did not use. I used a hand scoring model. I don't do that many of these, so I don't have the computer program. And then you get a section where you check off whether these particular variables meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and if they all do along the bottom of the test, then you say that the person has reaches the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also another indication for the severity of the post-traumatic, and the other variable is whether it's an acute or a chronic type of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay. So when you're giving this test to somebody, obviously the person is writing their own answers.
Yes, they fill in little circles.
All right. So does that mean, can this test be manipulated by people?
Sure.
To fake the answer?
Sure, absolutely.
And is that something that's easy to do?
No, not in this test, unless the person has read the manual, understands the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, and is in their mind trying to prove to someone that they do suffer from that disorder. This is not that well known. So this is not in every psychologist's office.
Okay. So in other words, would the person have to be very familiar with the test and PTSD itself to try and fake the answers?
Yes.
You told us, I think, already that this particular test confirms your hypothesis?
Yes.
And your hypothesis, well, what did it confirm for you?
Well, it confirmed that she did suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right. And how is it that you, well, I guess before that, let's talk about your other test, the MCMI.
Sure.
Okay. What test is that?
That, again, is a Milan Clinical Multi-Axel Inventory Test, third revision. It's a well-recognized and frequently used test to measure personality. And the diagnostic categories that are suggested by it conform also to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
All right. And how is this test scored?
This test is 175 items to which you answer true or false. It is also scored by a very complex computer-based algorithm, too complicated to be almost impossible to do by hand. And so I sent that test out to a professional scoring service that sent back the results. And, and I consider that to be like a second opinion, because I may have an idea of something, and a second psychologist has not interviewed the individual, and so this is the closest I can get to a second opinion without having to bring on another professional.
All right.
And it comes up with some diagnostic categories. It also comes up with some graphs and charts. And by analyzing the data that was presented to me, it confirmed that my suspicion was likely that she did suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay. And on this particular test, is there anything built into the test to indicate its accuracy?
Yes, there are scales there that are referred to as lie scales, validity scales, consistency scales, and she seemed to do fine on all of those.
And do those scales, does that somehow try to report whether or not it appears that the person is trying to fake the answers?
That's correct.
All right. And with regard to Miss Arias, did you say that her scores were showing valid?
Yes, the printout indicated that this was a valid result and that she appeared to respond in an accurate and honest manner.
Okay. All right. So based on these two tests and your meetings with Miss Arias, you say you formed the opinion that she has PTSD. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about PTSD.
Sure.
Okay. What is it?
Well, it's an anxiety disorder. It has some specific characteristics that I was able to relate to the various criteria that are listed here in the book. And in my report, I refer to the particular specific criteria that my study indicated Jodi, Miss Arias, meets particular criteria. And based on that and the confirmation from the two tests led me to feel very comfortable using the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. What it means is that an individual has a stress-related disorder that involves certain characteristics that are seen over and over again in people who are similarly diagnosed. There may be a sense of detachment. There may be emotional blunting. There may be intrusive thoughts.
Okay, let me stop you there.
Mm-hmm.
What's detachment?
Detachment is when a person is not quite in contact with reality. It's not psychosis, but they may be in an extreme state of denial. They may not be able to deal with certain issues. That's part of one of the characteristics.
All right, and what was the second one that you said?
Another characteristic would be an emotional blunting.
Okay, what's that?
When their emotional range is very constricted. The normal affect that we have, the highs and the lows that most people are able to present, except if you're obviously very depressed or whatever, then it's hard to do that, is restricted. So there's a very narrow range of emotions. A person may appear to be flat and emotionless. That's another characteristic.
All right.
And there are a lot, and I can read them for you if you want me to do that, and they're in my report.
We'll get into that, I think,
later.
specific
Okay.
to Jodi. With PTSD, so you're saying that it's something that is contained, PTSD, the diagnosis itself, is contained in the DSM?
Yes,
All right, so there are specific criteria, what you're just talking about.
that's right.
And in order to diagnose somebody, do you have to have these specific criteria?
You have to have a certain number of them. It's very specific. You have to have 3 out of 10, and then in one category, and then maybe 5 out of 6 in another category, and so on and so forth. And you just basically compare your notes, your decisions, your conclusions with those various criteria, and if the person meets enough of them, they got the diagnosis.
Okay. Judge, now's probably a good time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you back here at 3:15. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Counsel, please approach. We are at recess. Doctor, you may step down.